March 29th, 1987. Dean Martin walked onto the stage for the first time since burying his son, and before he said a word, everyone in the room knew something was wrong. There was no glass in his hand, no wink, no smile. He looked like a man who had aged decades in a single week. The band began the opening number, but Dean raised his hand and stopped them cold. His voice cracked as he leaned into the microphone and said, "Wait." The casino went dead silent. 2,400 people holding their breath. Then he said, "Before we start, I need to tell you something. What followed wasn't a performance. It wasn't comedy. It wasn't even music. It was a broken father standing under a spotlight, speaking from a place so raw and so exposed that by the time he finished, grown men were crying at blackjack tables, security guards were wiping their eyes, and Dean Martin himself could no longer hold back the tears. 8 days earlier, he had buried his son. The newspapers had covered the crash, the funeral, the silence that followed. Most people thought he would cancel. Frank Sinatra begged him to. The casino offered to shut the show down. But Dean insisted on going on stage because staying home meant drowning in grief. That night wasn't about entertainment. It was about survival. And when Dean Martin finally spoke, stripped of his persona, stripped of his armor, he didn't talk like a legend. He talked like a father who had lost the thing that mattered most. For the first time in his career, Dean Martin didn't try to make anyone laugh. He told the truth, and in doing so, he shattered an entire room. He stopped at that point because his body and mind were colliding in real time. Up until that sentence, he was still performing in the smallest possible way, standing upright, choosing words, controlling his breath. But the moment he said they found him on March 21st, in the mountains, he crossed the line he had not crossed since the funeral. That was the moment where memory stopped being distant and became physical. He wasn't just telling the audience what happened. He was reliving the exact instant when hope finally died. For 8 days, he had been living in shock, functioning on instinct, shaking hands, signing papers, listening to military officers, speaking calm, rehearsed voices. On that stage under those lights, with thousands of eyes on him, the shock finally cracked. When Dean said, they said the impact was instantaneous. He wasn't offering comfort to the audience. He was repeating the sentence that had been repeated to him over and over by officials, doctors, investigators, friends. It was the sentence everyone gives a parent who has lost a child suddenly because it's supposed to soften the blow. No pain, no fear, no suffering. But saying it out loud didn't bring peace. It exposed the lie beneath it, because instant or not, the loss was permanent, violent, absolute. And the way his voice dropped wasn't theatrical. It was his body trying to slow his breathing so he wouldn't collapse. That pause you're asking about is the moment he realized he could not protect the audience from his grief anymore. Dean Martin had spent his entire career protecting people from discomfort, smoothing everything with charm, humor, and distance. But there was no charm strong enough to hold back the truth that his son was gone forever. When he looked at the floor, he wasn't avoiding the crowd. He was anchoring himself, staring at something solid so he wouldn't dissolve in front of them. The silence in the room wasn't planned. It happened because no one dared interrupt a man standing at the edge of emotional freefall, calling his son my Dino. Instead of Dean, Paul Martin Jr. mattered deeply. That was the private name, the home name, the name that existed long before medals, uniforms, and rank. In that moment, the audience wasn't listening to a celebrity grieving. They were listening to a father who had lost the person he loved most in the world. That's why even people who had never cared about Dean Martin felt something break inside them. The illusion was gone. The King of Cool wasn't cool anymore. He was exposed, shaking, unfinished. And the reason this moment mattered so much is because Dean wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't trying to be brave. He wasn't even trying to be honest. He was trying to survive 4 more minutes without falling apart completely. Every word after that sentence was a negotiation with himself. Can I keep standing? Can I keep speaking? Can I stay here without running off this stage and never coming back? That pause was the exact second where he decided to stay, to let the audience see the cost of loving someone deeply, even if it destroyed the persona he had built over decades. That's why people remembered this night for the rest of their lives, not because of what Dean said next, but because of what that silence revealed. It revealed that no amount of fame, money, applause, or history could shield a man from the most human pain imaginable. And in that moment, standing silent under the lights, Dean Martin stopped being an entertainer and became something far more powerful. He became hell. Dean stood there, shaking, the small metal wings trembling between his fingers, as if they were suddenly too heavy. He tried to keep speaking, but his breath kept catching, each inhale sharp and uneven, the sound of a man fighting his own body. They tell you time heals, he said finally, forcing the words out. They tell you it gets easier, but nobody tells you that time doesn't heal anything if you're afraid to feel it. Nobody tells you that strength can turn into a prison. He closed his hand around the wings and pressed them against his chest. I thought if I stayed strong, if I didn't cry, if I didn't break, then maybe he wasn't really gone. Maybe this was all just some terrible mistake, and I'd wake up and call him and hear his voice again. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if the effort of holding himself together was finally exhausting him. But that's not strength. That's denial. And denial doesn't bring your son back. He looked out over the crowd again, his eyes red, unfocused, seeing not faces, but reflections of his own pain. You know what the worst part is? He asked quietly. Every night since March 21st, I keep thinking I hear the phone ring. I keep thinking it's him. I keep thinking he's calling to say, "Hey, Dad, false alarm, I'm fine." And for half a second, I believe it. His voice dropped to a whisper. That half second is the cruelest thing in the world. Somewhere in the audience, a man sobbed openly now, not bothering to hide it. Dean noticed, and instead of pulling back, he leaned into it. "I see you," he said softly. "I know that look. You've lost someone, too." Dean wiped his face with the back of his hand, but the tears kept coming. "I've made a living pretending," he said. "Pretending I'm drunk when I'm not. Pretending I don't care when I do. Pretending everything rolls off my back. But there's nothing to pretend about tonight." He took a shaky breath. "I loved my son more than anything on this earth. More than music. More than this stage. More than being Dean Martin. And losing him didn't just break my heart. It took my voice, not my singing voice. My reason." He held up the wings again, catching the light. These wings were supposed to mean freedom, flight, the sky. Now they just remind me that I couldn't protect him. He lowered his head, and for a long moment he couldn't speak at all. The casino was silent in a way Vegas had never been silent before. No glasses clinking, no machines ringing. Just shared grief hanging in the air. Finally, Dean lifted his head again. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to sing without him. I don't know how to joke without feeling guilty. I don't know how to be strong without lying to myself." He swallowed hard. "But I do know this. Tonight, I'm not going to pretend. Tonight, I'm going to let myself feel it, because if I don't, then I really will lose him all over again." He slipped the wings back into his pocket with deliberate care, like placing something sacred away. "So, if you came here tonight for laughs," he said gently, "I'm sorry. I don't have those for you. But if you came here as a parent, as a son, as someone who's loved and lost, then maybe we can get through this together." He looked down at the band, his voice barely holding. "Ken, let's try." The orchestra began softly, not the usual swaggering opening, but something slow, restrained, respectful. Dean leaned into the microphone, tears still on his face, and for the first time in his life, he didn't sing to entertain. He sang to survive. It wasn't the same voice. It trembled, cracked at the edges, stripped of polish, but somehow it carried more weight than it ever had before. Every note sounded like it had to fight its way out of his chest. "Everybody loves somebody sometime," he sang, and the words landed differently now. Heavier, crueler, almost mocking in their irony. His eyes were closed, his brow tight, as if he were holding himself together through sheer will. Halfway through the first verse, his voice broke completely. He stopped singing. The orchestra kept playing, unsure whether to continue, and Dean lifted his hand again, shaking his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I thought I could do this." No one moved. No one breathed. The room was frozen in collective heartbreak. He opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd. Really looked at them, not as an audience, not as strangers, but as people. "I've stood on stages my whole life," he said softly. "I've played rooms bigger than this. I've sung for kings, presidents, millionaires, and not once did I ever feel scared the way I feel scared right now." He swallowed hard. Because when you're singing for applause, the worst thing that can happen is silence. But when you're singing for your son, the worst thing that can happen is realizing he can't hear you anymore. A wave of sobbing moved through the room. People weren't trying to hide it now. They didn't want to. Dean took a breath that sounded like it hurt. "I keep thinking if I sing loud enough, if I sing good enough, maybe somehow it reaches him. Maybe wherever he is, he hears his old man messing up the words again and laughs about it." His mouth twitched into something that almost resembled a smile, but it collapsed just as quickly. That's how grief messes with you. It makes you believe stupid things because the truth is too heavy to carry. He looked down at the wings pinned to his lapel, touched them gently. These wings were supposed to mean flight, freedom, strength. Tonight they just mean love and loss. He nodded to the band again. "Let's try one more time," he said. The orchestra restarted, softer still, as if afraid of breaking him. Dean leaned into the microphone and sang again, and this time he didn't stop. His voice wavered, slipped, came back. He missed words, replaced them with hums, with breath, with raw sound, and somehow it was the most honest singing he had ever done. By the time he reached the end of the song, his face was soaked with tears, but he finished it. He stood there afterward, eyes closed, head bowed, as the room erupted into applause that didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like gratitude, like love. Dean opened his eyes and raised a hand, asking for quiet again. "Thank you," he said, barely audible. "Not for the applause. For letting me do this. For letting me be weak in front of you." He took another breath. If you've lost someone, if you're carrying something you don't know how to live with, don't let anyone tell you how to grieve. Don't let anyone rush you. And don't let anyone tell you that being broken means you're failing. Sometimes it just means you loved someone right. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I loved my son right." He looked toward the front row where Frank Sinatra sat, eyes red, hands clasped together like he was praying. Their eyes met, and for a moment nothing else existed. Dean gave him the smallest nod, a silent thank you for being there. Then he turned back to the microphone. "I'm going to keep singing tonight," he said, "not because I'm strong, but because if I stop, I don't know how to breathe." He glanced down once more at the wings. "This one's for you, Dino," he murmured. And then the band began again, and Dean Martin sang through the pain, through the tears, through the silence his son had left behind, not as a legend, not as the king of cool, but as a father doing the only thing he knew how to do to survive another night.world. And that is why the people who were there never forgot it. Years later, they wouldn't remember which songs he sang or how his voice sounded on any particular note. They remembered how it felt to watch a man they'd grown up idolizing stand stripped of every defense and admit, without shame, that love had broken him. They remembered the stillness in the room, the way time seemed to stop, the way strangers reached for each other's hands without thinking. They remembered leaving that casino quieter than they arrived, speaking in whispers, as if they had just walked out of a church rather than a showroom. For Dean Martin, that night changed everything. The applause no longer fed him the way it once had. The laughter didn't land the same. Somewhere on that stage, while 2,400 voices carried his song for him, he understood something he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. The act had protected him, but it had also kept him distant. And once the act was gone, once the mask fell, he couldn't put it back on. He didn't want to. Grief had taken his son, but it had also taken his fear of being seen. From that night forward, Dean sang like a man with nothing left to hide. He sang slower, softer. Sometimes he sang like he was talking directly to one person in the dark. Sometimes he sang like he was talking to someone who wasn't there anymore, and audiences felt it. They didn't come for the cool anymore. They came because they needed to see someone survive something unbearable and keep breathing anyway. They came because Dean Martin had done what most people never dared to do in public. He had told the truth. When he finally walked away from the stage for good, there was no grand announcement, no farewell tour. He simply stopped, as if the music had carried him as far as it could. Aziz Wanshidi said goodbye to his son out loud. There was nothing left to prove, and when he died years later, quietly on Christmas morning, the headlines talked about the legend, the Rat Pack, divorce, the movies. But the people who truly understood Dean Martin knew the real story wasn't about fame at all. It was about a father who loved his son so completely that losing him shattered every illusion he'd ever built. That night in March 1987 wasn't the end of Dean Martin. It was the moment Dino Crocetti finally stepped into the light, not as a performer, not as an equal, but as a human being who loved deeply, grieved openly, and showed the world that strength doesn't come from holding it together. Sometimes it comes from letting yourself fall apart in front of others and trusting that they will catch you.